This video is sponsored by Concierge Render by CoreWeave. What's up everybody? Today we're going to be going through how to create this kind of hairy dancing man with Blender's hair particles. We'll be covering the basics of Blender's hair particle system and the basics of particle edit and also the basics of hair dynamics. The character model and the character animation are from a free motion capture library that I'll go through later in this video, so everybody should be able to follow along with this video. However, if you want my project files, they will be available on Patreon. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to download a motion capture animation and model so that we can apply our hair particle system to it. I'm going to be using Mixamo, which is owned by Adobe, though it is free to use, so you do not need to have an Adobe subscription to use it. You come over here to characters and you can just kind of pick a character you want. I chose a simple model because I didn't want the geometry intersecting with the hair too much. After that, you click over on animations and you can search up here and pick animations to apply. I'm going to choose a dance that loops because I'd like to create a looping animation for Instagram. Then you can click download, and when you download it, it'll give you a couple options. You can choose your frame rate here. I'm going to set mine to 24, and you can also choose to reduce the keyframes. When you import it in Blender, if all the keyframes are actually causing your computer to lag, you can try downloading with reduced keyframes and it may be a little bit easier on your machine. When you download, it's going to give you an FBX, and then we can head over here in Blender, hit File, Import, FBX, and it will import our character into Blender. So what I'm going to do first to start is I'm just going to pull this timeline up, and we can see all of our keyframes here. So I'm just going to head down to the end of all the keyframes, which I have here at 384, and I'm going to go ahead and change my endpoint. Now I'm going to copy some of the keyframes, and this is for later when we're doing simulation to kind of help it loop, or at least come close to a loop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a couple of these keyframes here. I'm going to hit Shift Duplicate. Then I'm going to move these off to the side here. I'm going to zoom out, and then I'm going to grab those and drag those up here to the beginning. And what I'm trying to do is just get some of those keyframes before the animation starts, and we can bake the simulation early, and that'll help it look like it's looping a bit more. Do the same thing here. Grab some of those keyframes and we'll duplicate those, bring those down here. I'm just holding Shift D to duplicate and G to grab. So let's go ahead, grab those, move those back over. We'll just drag this timeline down here and we're ready to begin shading our character. So let's go ahead and switch this over to Material Preview, and I'm going to be using Cycles. And you can see here that it imported from Mixamo, or it should have imported the texture there. I'm just going to drag this window over here. I'm going to put in the shader editor. And I'm going to come over here on the character to the materials. And I'm just going to delete that body texture, create a new texture, and call this one body. Let's go ahead, delete this, and we'll add a diffuse. And then I want to create kind of some stripes on this character to add just a variation of color to the hair later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a wave texture, and I'm going to plug this color here into the diffuse texture. Then we kind of have our bands and our signs, and you can see that that's kind of a warbly look, but I want more kind of uniform stripes going up and down. So I have Node Wrangler enabled in the add-on, so I'm going to hit Control T, and that's going to give me a texture coordinate and a mapping. I'm just going to delete the mapping node, and then I'm going to add a separate X, Y, and Z node. Put that there. I'm going to take this generated texture coordinate because we're going to generate new coordinates. We're going to put it in there, and then now we can separate our coordinates. So we can feed these into here for the vector, and that'll allow us to kind of control what direction it's going. So I want it to go here with the Y, and you can see that now it's going up that way. I'm going to change sine to saw, and then I'm going to change my scale to 2 and my distortion to 2. I'll leave my detail at 2, and I'll leave my detail scale at 1. And this still looks a little strange, whereas I want more kind of traditional stripes. So what I'm going to do is drag these over. I'm going to add a color ramp and put that here. And then I'm going to change this linear mode to constant. Then I'm going to drag this over, and now you can see that we have stripes. So you can add as many stripes or colors as you want here. I'm going to change this one here so that I can see just a different color here randomly for now. And you can kind of play with the placement of these, but I'm just going to leave it there kind of equally distributed. So I've kind of chosen some colors. I like to use Color Hunt to look for color palettes, and if you click here to palettes, they have all these awesome colors, and you can come up here to trendy and kind of just look at colors. So I'm just going to pull a couple colors from there and add them to my gradient ramp. Okay, great. So I kind of like the look of that as our base color for the skin of our character. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create our material for our hair, which we will use later. So let's go ahead, add a new material. We're going to click body. We're going to click this little icon here so that we can create a new material from that. We're going to call this one hair. So the hair setup's going to be a bit different. So this texture coordinate system with the generative won't work with the hair because the hair is just going to change over time. So you'll see the colors kind of shifting around when the hair is animated. It'll work for still, but not for motion. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this up here. I'm going to add an image editor, and we're going to create a hair texture here. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to come back here to the body. I'm going to add an image texture in here. I'm just going to leave that floating there. I'm going to select that hair texture right there. Then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to turn off the particle in the viewport. And then I'm going to change this to material preview so that I can see kind of my dancer moving around there with the stripes. Then I'm going to come up to this tab up here and I'm going to come down to bake. I'm going to select our dancer, and then I'm going to select the image node over here so that it's highlighted. I'm going to change the bake type from combined to diffuse, and then you have these options. By default they're all on. I'm going to turn off direct and indirect so that only color's on, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit bake. So now that it's done baking, you can see that we now have all of our characters' colors baked here into the UV map. So we're just going to go ahead, delete that, close this. And we're going to go ahead and come back to the materials, go over to hair. We're going to add that image node into hair. Now there's a lot of steps in this process, so if you have trouble following along, these videos are recorded at 60 FPS, so you can watch it back in slow motion. We're going to delete that diffuse. We're going to take that image texture. We're going to select hair. We're going to add a hair BSDF. We're going to put that there. We're going to leave the default settings up here, but down here we're going to turn random roughness up to 1, and then we're going to put this color input into there. And now this should work for our hair. So I'm just going to close this window now, and now we can finally kind of dive into the hair system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the basics of the hair system first, then we'll go through our particle edit tool, and then we'll go through hair dynamics. So let's go ahead and add some hair to our character. So we'll just click this little plus icon up here on the particle system. We're going to switch over to hair, and we're going to turn on advanced. And you can see here now that it's kind of added some hair. So let's go through what all of these settings do here. So under the emission tab, we have number, which is how many parent particles we have, which all these are parent particles. And then here we have the hair length, which controls the length of those particles, and the segments, which controls the segments of these. If we come down here to source, we can change where these particles are emitted from. Hair dynamics we will cover later. Velocity is the velocity of the particle, so kind of the direction of the particle, and you can play with that and randomize that if you want. Down here in the physics, we can kind of adjust the forces on the hair. So if we go in here and add 0.5, you can see that it's kind of wrinkling that hair up. So just change that back to 0. Under the render tab here, we can change how the hair is rendered, and you have path, object, collection, and things like that. We're going to leave that to path. Down here we can change it to a B-spline, and that'll render a tiny bit faster, and what that does is it calculates a B-spline from kind of the in point to the out point of the hair. It's not as realistic, but it renders quicker. Here we have steps, so if you're doing hair simulations, for example hair dynamics, and you can add more steps, it's as if the hair has more kind of like steps along the particle that can bend and deform. So the higher this is, the better your hair will look in animation, but also the slower it will be on your computer. Viewport display, if you're having a hard time moving around in your viewport and it's moving slow, you can change the amount that are displayed. And this one right here, you need to make sure you're aware of this because this will trick a lot of people. They'll be doing other things and their hair will look wonky. You need to make sure that your strand steps match your render steps. That way you know you're getting kind of an accurate view in the viewport. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a couple extra steps here and here and turn on B-spline so that it can demonstrate some of these other features. So let's go to children. So children will add a bunch of children particles around every parent particle. So this is going to be kind of necessary for anything you're doing with fur or anything that you really want to cover a surface with, because it's going to be a lot quicker to do these child particles than it is to be doing a ton of particles up here. So you have simple and interpolated, and you can see immediately that we have more hair. And down here we have the display amount and the render amount. So if we display to 100, we can see how many particles we actually have. But again, this may lag your viewport, so you can lower the amount of particles there. So Blender actually has quite a few options for people on lower end machines to still work with hair and kind of make your viewport still move quickly. Here we have the length of the child particles. And coming down here, this is where the real magic happens, where you can add a lot of character to your hair. So you have clumping, which as it does clumps the hair around each parent particle. You can kind of see how all those child particles are now kind of tying in to the end of the parent particles that they are coming from. You can add clump noise to add some randomness to that, but you can also come down here to the roughness, and here you can add roughness to the hair. So let's go ahead and add some random roughness at a high value of 10. Let's make that even higher. Let's do 100, and you can kind of see here that it's just making all the hair look rough. So this kind of looks a little bit more like animal fur or maybe a person with frizzy hair. So let's go ahead and we will remove that randomness and come down here to kink. Now this is where a lot of people get hung up. They're trying to figure out how to make curly hair and things like that. Well, all that's done here under the kink tab. So if we look in the kink tab, you have curl, radial, wave, braid, spiral, and you can play with all those and see what they do. I'm going to show you what curl does. If you click curl here, you now have all these features. This clump feature here will determine how much this clump up here has an effect over your curls. So I'm just going to leave that at 1 because most of the time you're going to want that to fully affect what you're doing. And I'm going to play with the amplitude here, and you can see that the amplitude is kind of changing the size of the effect. So let's just leave that at 0.2, and let's turn our frequency up to something like 10. And you can see that now we have 10 curls that are moving across each of these strands of hair. And if we turn the flatness up to 1, you can actually see that a little better, because that flatness is flattening out the hair particle and making it a little less random. So you can kind of see how the curls go there. You can play with all these settings and get something that you like. For now, I'm just going to put these back to default. If we come down here, we have the hair shape. And if you look here, we can change the size of the radius root and the tip. Now this isn't always visible here in the viewport, so what you need to do is switch to rendered mode or go to your render. You can see here that we have very thin hair. So what we can do is we can change this tip to 1, and that'll make it so that the end thickness is the same as the beginning thickness, but it still looks thin, and we do want it to kind of have a taper off. So what we could do is just crank this all the way up to a high value there, and you can see suddenly we kind of have this hair just jutting out in all the directions, and you can see it much better. Down here we have the vertex groups, so that kind of correlates with the vertex groups you have here. So what you can do is you can actually go in there and you can select these vertex groups and say that you only want hair to come from the head, and then your length and your clump and your kink, and you can work with all of that. You can texture paint those vertex groups so they can get variation. You can also use weight painting in conjunction with these vertex groups to get a variation so that you can get a nice fall off and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the length for now, and I'm going to switch over to particle edit mode so that we can run through those features. So I'm just going to hit tab here and switch to particle edit mode. Immediately you can see that it's removed all the children particles and we're only seeing the parent particles. You can actually turn on the children particles if you want to view those too, but it can slow down your machine when you're editing. So I'm just going to leave parent particles on for now. We're going to go through the different tool options that we have. So if you come up here, you have your radius and your strength, and that kind of goes for all the tools that we have over here. But first you have comb. So comb just lets you, as you would expect, comb the particles in any direction. Now, one mistake I see a lot of beginners making is they come in here with some giant brush and it turned all the way up to 1 on the strength, and they just comb all the particles. If you want realistically combed hair, you really need to get in there with a small brush and kind of like finesse where you want the particles to appear. If we come down here, we have a smooth particle, and this, as you would expect, just smooths out the strands of hair. Here we have add, and if we click and add along here, it will just add more parent particles. So sometimes when you do your hair particles, you'll have like bald patches, and you can just go in there and kind of paint some parent particles. Of course, the more particles you add, the slower it's going to go. With length, you can just adjust the length of the particles and kind of grow out. And you can also do the opposite and shorten as well. With puff, this is more for when you have things combed down. So if I comb this down and come here to puff, we can start to kind of puff that hair back out. So a lot of times hair is going to hang down and you're going to want to puff it out. That's kind of a common practice. And those are kind of some of the basic tools that you have here in Particle Edit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and I'm just going to show you some settings that we can use to kind of get a good looking hair. And then after that, we're going to turn on hair dynamics and run through how to use those. You can see now that we've edited our particles, we have this kind of lock up here. We can't change these things. That's because it's maintaining those particle edits we have, which we were just doing an example. So for now, I'm going to delete edit and we will come back to those later. So let's get started. I think 1,000 particles is a good number to start on. For the length, I'm just going to leave it at 0.25. By default, it's at 4, but I lowered it earlier. We're going to come down here to source. I'm going to change from faces and jitter to faces and random to get a little bit more of a random look. And then I'm going to hit use modifier stack. And what that's going to do is that if I had a subsurface up here, it's going to notice that and it's going to use that and incorporate that in its hair calculation. This is incredibly important if you're using one of your own characters. It's also worth noting that if you're using a character that is rigged, you want the armature to be above the particle stack up here. Otherwise, hair dynamics will not work. We're going to skip all the way down here to physics, and I'm going to leave this on Newtonian. I'm going to do forces with this Brownian value. I'm just going to add 0.1, and you can see that's going to kind of stir the hair up in kind of random directions, which is what I want. Then I'm going to come down here to children, and for my previous example I still have it left on, but by default it's none. I'm going to click interpolated, and for the amount of children on render I'm just going to leave 100, but I'm going to turn the length of the children down to maybe 0.75, and that'll make it look a little more controlled. I'm going to come down here to the clumping, and I don't want a lot of clumping because I'm not really going for kind of dirty animal fur or anything. Just want a little bit of clumping to make it look more natural. So I'm going to add 0.1 clumping there, and you can see that just kind of tightens those up a tiny bit. I'm going to come down here to the roughness, and with the uniform roughness, which will just apply a uniform amount across the board, I'm just going to do 1.5, but I also want some randomness. So I'm going to go ahead and apply 1 random there. I'm actually going to leave kinks off here, and I'm going to come down here. I'm going to play with the hair shape. So I'm going to switch over to render mode to get an idea of what my hair looks like. And we can see here that it's very thin. So I want to make sure that I'm rendering the right material for this. So if we come up here to the render tab, we can choose render as path, and then we can choose our material here. Right now it's set to body, but we want to use that hair shader that we used because the hair shader is actually optimized for hair rendering and will render much faster. So we'll come down here and we're going to go to the hair shape, and I want to make this hair thicker. So with the tip right now going out to 0, I'm going to turn that up to 1 because I don't want it to completely dissipate at the end. And then I'm just going to put the high value here in the bottom. So let's say maybe 100. And I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. So I know that turning up the particles is going to lag my viewport display. So what I'm actually going to do is just hit render so that I can get an idea of what the hair particles actually look like now. And it's just going to give me a render here. Now you'll notice that when you're doing particles, your BVH load time up here is going to take much longer. So your BVH load time will load off of your processor. So depending on how fast your processor is will depend on how fast it loads the entire scene before it actually begins rendering your scene. And that's just going to take longer when you're rendering hair particles. So sometimes while it's building the BVH, you may actually get an error and it may stop saying you're out of memory. That means that your computer's run out of memory and it can't render all the particles in the scene. So the way to fix that is to go back and lower the amount of particles. So here in our render result, we can see what the final hair is going to look like, and I'm pretty happy with the amount of hair and kind of the texture of hair I have. So a couple notes for hair dynamics. If you're a beginner, you're probably going to want to get all your comb edits in before turning on hair dynamics because editing after that can be kind of difficult. Also, before I mentioned that add tool, and if you go in here and you start adding a bunch of particles, hair dynamics won't account for them and they'll actually start smearing around. Adding those particles is fine for still frames, but once it comes to animation, it needs to know how many particles it needs to animate from this emission number here, which you can't change after combing and edit. But let's get into how to do hair dynamics. It's actually pretty simple. It's pretty much as simple as checking this box. And now you can see this little red line appears here. And if we play forward, it'll try and simulate the animation here, but it's going to play back really slowly in the viewport. So what we're going to do is we can actually cache the animation down here, but first let's go through some of the animation settings we have here. So first and foremost is quality steps. The higher the quality this is, the longer it will take to bake the cache, but the higher quality the animation simulation will be. Down here we have structure and volume, and a lot of these are self-explanatory, including the mass of the hair, the stiffness of the hair, dampening, air drag, and all things. You can play with those until you get a look you like. I'm going to leave mine at mostly default, but because I'm doing kind of more rougher curly hair, I'm just going to add a little bit of stiffness by turning this up to 1 so that it holds a tiny bit of its structure. So down here we have the simulation start and end. And what we can do is we can bake this cache, and if we bake it, it won't be trying to calculate it real time. It'll have that saved, and you can save that to a disk location by checking this box, but I'm just going to save mine to Blender, so I'm just going to leave it as is. But by baking this cache, we can vastly speed up the viewport performance of this animation because it'll have already calculated the simulation. So what I'm going to do is just change these. So I know that my start is 1, and I want my simulation to kind of start a couple frames before because I want to try and get a somewhat loopable image from this, although it's very difficult to get an actual loop with simulations in Blender this way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do -50, so the simulation will start 50 frames before, as you can see the red line there. And then what I'm going to do is my end is 384, so I'm just going to do 384 plus 10 and just give it a couple frames there so that it'll kind of start up, and hopefully that'll match a little bit better when we go out to render. And then what you do is you can click this bake to cache here, and then what that will do is that will just start your point cache render down here, and you should have this little option here. Now if this crashes, what you can do to help speed up is just lower the render quality here under hair dynamics, and you can lower that. I have mine set to max, so it's going to bake out this cache very slowly, but you can speed that up by turning down the quality. And then once you have that, if you want to make any edits to the hair dynamics, or if you want to make any edits to kind of the comb edit or the particles, or any edits you want to make, you'll have to rebake that cache. So what you'll do is you'll get these options down here where you can see delete all the bake, and then there's a delete button that'll appear here once it's done baking, and you'll have to delete the cache and recache it to kind of play back that animation. So just keep that in mind, that if you're trying to make any edits after the animation's there, you need to delete the cache first. So now we have our cache bake, so we can go ahead and play our animation back here. And for the sake of speed, I've gone ahead and turned the display amount of children down to 0. If we play here, we can kind of get a preview of what our hair animation is going to look like. And if you're not satisfied with what that looks like, you can go up here and you can adjust, can click delete bake here. And then you can come up here and just kind of play with the settings until you get something that you like. In terms of lighting the scene, I recommend using a HDR from HDR Haven, and that's kind of a simple way that you can light the scene and maybe put them on a ground plane. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and render out my animation. Let's face it, rendering hair particles takes a lot of power. You can use Eevee, but it's not going to look as real. You can lower the particles, but it's not going to look as good. In my opinion, the best option is a render farm, but typically they're too expensive. That's why I was excited when Concierge Render contacted me from CoreWeave, and they gave me some credits to test out their service, and I have to say, it is absolutely amazing. All the frames are rendered simultaneously. You can run on 520 GPUs at the same time, and sometimes people look at the price and they think that it's expensive because it's $15 for 1 minute of rendering, but they're not considering that in 1 minute you're actually using 520 GPUs, so it's almost like you've been rendering for 8.5 hours. It eliminates creative constraints. As an artist, you now have affordable access so that you have creative freedom and you can kind of boost your creativity and explore the world of 3D much easier from a single machine. I was able to render this animation in less than 4 minutes for less than $2. And this entire animation only cost me about 15 minutes and a little over $10. This piece only took an hour and cost less than $50, which is incredible for an intense production quality render. Check out the link in the description below. I highly recommend it. As I said, I'm going to be using this moving forward for my personal projects and for my client projects because I was just so impressed with the service. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, that means you just spent a good amount of your life learning how to make a hairy man dance. So congratulations. Let me know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future in the comments below, and thank you for watching.